The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1882, and the words on it were so blunt that the postmaster in Clearwater, Kansas, read it 3 times before handing it over, half certain he had misread something. Edna Thatcher took the slip of paper from his fingers without ceremony, read it in the space of 10 seconds, folded it neatly in half, and tucked it into the front pocket of her work apron. Then she walked back out into the bright May sunshine, as if she had merely been told that her flower order had arrived. The postmaster watched her go and shook his head slowly. That woman, he thought, was the most unreadable creature in all of Clearwater County. Which was, in the estimation of most of the county, not a compliment. Edna Thatcher was 28 years old, the daughter of a wheat farmer who had died of a lung ailment 2 winters ago, and she had been running the Thatcher homestead herself ever since. Not with a husband's help, not with a brother's oversight, but alone. With 2 hired hands she paid fair wages, and treated with the same no-nonsense directness she applied to everything in her life. She kept her accounts in a ledger with columns so precise they could have passed for a bank's. She shod her own horses when the farrier was busy. She had, on one memorable occasion, negotiated a grain contract with a railroad agent who had arrived expecting to deal with a grieving widow who might be talked into a low price, and she had sent him back on the afternoon train with a contract that made her neighbors whistle when the terms got around. She was, in the language that circulated through the saloons and feed stores and church socials of Clearwater, described as too independent for any ranch. Too independent for any man, some said, though they usually had the decency to lower their voices before saying it. Edna herself had heard the talk. She was not a woman given to pretending she was ignorant of things she clearly was not ignorant of. She had simply decided, somewhere around her 25th birthday, that the opinions of men who could not balance their own accounts were not opinions she needed to weight very heavily in the direction of her life. The telegram was from a lawyer in Dodge City. It informed her that her late father's younger brother, a man she had met exactly twice as a child, had died intestate and without heirs other than Edna herself. He had left behind a property called the Garrison Creek Ranch, 740 acres in the Cimarron territory just south of the Kansas line, along with a herd of about 80 cattle, a barn, a main house, and a debt of $400 owed to a man named John Garrison. The name Garrison was the same as the ranch's name. That was either a coincidence or it was not, and Edna intended to find out which. She spent 2 days settling the most pressing matters on her own farm, arranging for her hired hands, a steady older man named Curtis and his nephew Dill, to manage things in her absence. And then she packed a single canvas traveling bag, hitched her bay mare to the wagon, and pointed herself south. The drive took the better part of 4 days. The Kansas plains in May were a particular shade of green that felt almost improbable, as if the land was making a promise it might not keep come August, and Edna found herself settling into the rhythm of the road, with the quiet, steady satisfaction she always felt when she was moving toward something with a clear purpose. The uncertainty of what she'd find did not unsettle her. Uncertainty had been her companion for the better part of 3 years. She had learned to treat it like weather, something to account for but not to fear. She arrived at the edges of the Cimarron territory on the evening of the 4th day, following a dirt road that wound along the southern edge of a shallow creek that she suspected gave the ranch its name. The land here was different from the Kansas wheat country. She was used to wider, somehow, and rougher, with cedar breaks and red clay draws cutting into the rolling grassland. The sky was enormous in a way that even Kansas sky was not, and the evening light turned everything the color of old copper. She found the main house as the last light was fading. It was a solid structure, not grand but not neglected, a low-slung log and frame building with a covered porch that ran the full length of the front. A barn stood about 50 yards behind it, its doors open, warm lamplight spilling from the gap. 2 horses were in the corral beside the barn, and a third was being led back in from the pasture by a tall figure she could not yet make out clearly. Edna pulled her wagon to a stop near the porch and set the brake. The figure leading the horse paused and looked toward her. Then, with a deliberateness that matched her own, the figure tied the horse to the corral rail and walked toward the wagon. In the dying light she made out the details gradually. He was tall, over 6 feet, with the kind of build that came from actual physical labor rather than any vanity about it, broad through the shoulders, lean through the middle, with hands she noticed right away were the hands of a working man. He wore a faded canvas coat over a work shirt, and his hat was pushed back in a way that suggested he'd had it pushed back all day and hadn't bothered to straighten it. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, she guessed perhaps 34 or 35, with a face that had been sun-browned and wind-cut into something that was honestly not at all unattractive, though Edna told herself she was noting this the way she would note the structural soundness of a fence post. "You'd be Edna Thatcher," he said. It was not a question. His voice was low and even, and he said her name without any of the too familiar shortening to just Edna that most men tried within 5 seconds. "I would be," she said, "and you're John Garrison, the same." He stopped a few feet from the wagon and looked up at her with dark eyes that were doing what she recognized as a thorough assessment, the same way she assessed a piece of property or an animal, not rude, just careful. "I expected you a day later. I drive faster than lawyers anticipate," she said. "I understand my uncle owed you $400. Something in his expression shifted very slightly, not quite a smile, but a small, involuntary acknowledgement of something. "That's one way to start a conversation. It's the relevant one," she said. "I'd like to understand the situation plainly before I've been here an hour." He studied her for another moment, and then he nodded slowly and held out a hand to help her down from the wagon seat. She took it without hesitation. She was not too proud to take a steadying hand when she had been sitting for 6 hours, and stepped down to the red Kansas dust. "I'll tell you the plain truth of it over supper," he said. "I've got a stew on the stove that'll do for 2. She followed him into the house, which was cleaner on the inside than she had expected from a bachelor rancher, and they sat across from each other at a plank table, while a cedar log burned low in the iron stove, and the night settled in around the walls. John Garrison told her the story straight, the way she had asked. He had been working Thatcher land, her uncle's land, for 3 years as a foreman and part-owner partner under a verbal agreement that had never been written down, which was, he said with the flat tone of a man who had learned his lesson, a mistake he would not repeat. Her uncle, a man named Wade Thatcher, had borrowed $400 from John 2 years ago to purchase the seed cattle that currently made up the bulk of the herd, with the understanding that John's partnership stake would be formalized in a written document once the cattle were established and turning a profit. Wade Thatcher had died before that document was written, and now the entire property technically passed to Edna. "The debt is documented," John said, setting a folded paper on the table between them. Wade wrote it down himself. "I'm not claiming a partnership stake without a document to back it. I don't do business that way. But the $400 is owed, and beyond that I've got 3 years of labor in this land, and I'll be straight with you about what that means." Edna picked up the document and read it carefully. Her uncle's handwriting was cramped but legible. The terms were as John had described. She set it back on the table. "What does the ranch owe for operating expenses beyond the debt to you?" she asked. "About $60 to the feed merchant in Enid," he said. "I can show you the full accounts tomorrow." "I'll want to see them tonight," she said. He looked at her for a beat, and then he stood and went to a cabinet near the stove and came back with a ledger, which he set on the table in front of her without a word. She read it for 20 minutes while the stew cooled in their bowls, and he did not rush her or make small talk, which she appreciated more than she would have said. The accounts were good. Not excellent, There were 2 years where the cattle numbers had not grown as they should, and the reason was a drought year she remembered even up in Kansas, but honest, and the notation system was clear and systematic. "You're a careful man with figures," she said. "My mother taught school," he said. She looked up at him. That was a more personal detail than she had expected from him, and it surprised her enough that she gave him a long look. He was watching her with that steady, unhurried attention that she was starting to understand was simply how he operated in the world, not as a performance but as a habit. "All right," she said. "I'll be here at least 2 weeks to assess the property and decide what's to be done. I'll pay the debt out of the estate proceeds, but I want a full accounting of the herd first. And I want to understand exactly what your role has been here before I make any decisions about going forward." "Fair enough," he said. "I'll take you out at first light." They ate the stew, which was good venison and wild onion and a little dried corn, and talked about the ranch with the careful, slightly impersonal directness of two people conducting business. And then Edna asked if she could use the small back bedroom she had spotted on her way to the table. "It's yours by right of inheritance," he said, and there was something in the dry precision of it that almost made her smile. Almost. She did not quite smile. Not yet. The next morning she was up before dawn, and so was he. They did not compete over who had risen earliest. They simply both appeared in the kitchen at the same time, looked at each other in the early gray light, and without any negotiation she made the coffee while he fried the eggs. It was a small, unremarkable thing, and she noted it. The ride out to sea, the herd took most of the morning. The ranch land was rougher than she had expected from the flat description in the lawyer's telegram. It rolled and broke in creek-cut ravines, with pasture opening up in the bottoms and cedar and scrub oak climbing the slopes. It was harder land to work than the Kansas wheat country, but it was also, she could see, land with potential that had not yet been fully realized. John rode beside her and told her the lay of the land the way someone tells a story they know well with economy and precision, pointing out the seasonal water sources, the south-facing pastures that stayed greenest in early spring and late fall, the areas where the fence needed repair, and the areas where he had put in improvements. He had built the second corral himself the previous year. He had dug out a silting stock tank and relined it with clay. He had, she noticed as they rode, a rancher's eye for land, the particular quality of attention that sees not just what is there, but what is working and what is not. She asked questions steadily, and he answered them steadily, and by midday she had a clear picture of the ranch that was more detailed and more useful than anything the lawyer in Dodge City had given her. They stopped at noon by the creek that gave the ranch its name and ate the cornbread and salt pork she had wrapped in cloth that morning, sitting on the bank with their horses cropping at the creek-edge grass behind them. "You know your land," she said. "I've worked to know it," he said. She watched the water move over the flat stones. "You could have left when my uncle died, gone somewhere else. 3 years of labor without a written agreement, and the man who gave you his word is gone. Most men would have called it a loss and walked away." He was quiet for a moment. "Most men didn't put in the work I put in," he said finally. "And I don't give up on things I've built just because the circumstances get difficult." She looked at him sideways. He was looking at the water, forearms resting on his knees, his hat sitting on the ground beside him. In the daylight, with the creek sound and the big May sky overhead, he looked like a man who was completely, quietly at home in the landscape he occupied. There was something grounding about that. She recognized the quality because it was one she valued in herself. "What will you do if I decide to sell the property?" she asked. It was not a threat. She genuinely wanted to know what he would say. He turned to look at her directly. "I'll buy it from you if I can raise the capital, or I'll find another outfit to work. But I hope you won't sell it." He paused. "I hope you'll stay." The last sentence hung in the air between them with a weight that was slightly different from the rest of the conversation, and they both noticed it, and neither of them addressed it, and the moment moved on down the creek with the current. Over the following days, Edna's assessment of the ranch deepened and changed. She had come expecting to evaluate a troubled property and make a practical decision, pay the debt, sell or keep, return to her own life. What she found instead was a place that had been loved, in the particular way that people who work land love it, which is through the evidence of their work on its face. The fence lines that John had repaired were repaired correctly, with the tensioning that would hold through a hard winter. The cattle were healthy and well distributed across the pasture. The small kitchen garden behind the house had been tended with more care than she would have expected from a man living alone. There were fruit trees that someone had planted along the south wall of the house, a peach and 2 apple trees, young but established, which meant someone had looked at this place and thought about what it would be in 5 years. She asked him about the trees on the 4th day. "My idea," he said simply. They were walking the south fence line together, checking the posts. Land that has a future in it should show that future, even when it's small. She stopped walking for a moment and looked at the trees, which were just beginning to leaf out in the warm May air, their branches a tender new green against the weathered wood of the house wall. "That's a thoughtful way to look at it," she said. "You sound surprised," he said, and the tone was not wounded, only observational. "Not surprised," she said carefully, "just noting it." He looked at her with that steady attention again, and this time she noticed that his eyes were not quite the dark brown she had assumed in the poor light of the first evening. They were a deep hazel, actually, warm and considered. She noticed this and then noticed herself noticing it, which was not something she typically did, and she turned back to the fence line and resumed walking. On the 5th day, a man rode out from the town of Red Fork, which was the nearest settlement, about 8 miles to the east. His name was Silas Pemberton, and he was, by the way he rode and the way he talked, a man who thought well of himself. He was perhaps 45, thick through the middle, with a cattleman's air of authority that he had probably been cultivating since he was 20. He tipped his hat to Edna with the exaggerated courtesy that men of his type used on women they intended to underestimate, and then he spent about 3 sentences on pleasantries before getting to the point. "I heard old Wade's property came to a niece," he said. "I want to make you a fair offer, Miss Thatcher. $4,000 for the land and cattle all in." Edna had heard of Silas Pemberton already, one of the ranch hands. A young man named Felipe who worked the eastern pasture had mentioned him as a neighbor who had a habit of buying up land when owners died or went under. She had noted this the way she noted everything useful. "That's a generous offer," she said, in the tone that meant she would not be taking it. Pemberton seemed to assume her politeness indicated openness to negotiation. "I could go to 4,200, he said. "Mr. Pemberton," Edna said, "I've been on this land 5 days and I've already identified 2 water sources that haven't been developed, 300 acres of south pasture that are being underutilized, and a cattle operation that is solid despite being under-resourced. The land alone is worth more than what you've offered. I appreciate you making the trip, but I won't be selling." There was a long pause. Pemberton looked over her shoulder to where John was standing at the corral fence, watching the exchange with the particular quality of stillness that Edna was learning meant he was paying close attention to something. "You planning on running the place yourself then?" Pemberton said, and the polite veneer had thinned considerably. "I'm planning on giving that serious consideration," she said. Pemberton turned his horse without another word. Edna watched him go, and then she heard the quiet creak of the corral gate and John's boots on the ground behind her. "He'll be back," John said. "I imagine so," she said. "He seems like the persistent type. He's got money and he's patient. In this county, that's a combination that's gotten him a good deal of land that other people worked hard to develop." "Not this land," Edna said, and the certainty in her own voice surprised her a little. "Not this land." She turned that over in her mind for the rest of the afternoon, examining it from different angles the way she would examine a contract term she wasn't sure about. She had come here to make a practical decision. She had a good farm in Kansas that she knew and understood. She had no particular attachment to this red clay territory, No history here beyond a twice-met uncle and his debt. But she looked at the fruit trees against the house wall. She looked at the careful fence lines and the well-tended cattle and the creek running clear over its flat stones. She looked at the accounts in the ledger that showed 3 years of steady, patient work in a difficult country. And she thought about what it would mean to walk away from something that had that quality of care in it. On the 7th evening, after supper, she and John sat on the covered porch in the 2 wooden chairs that faced the big western sky, and she asked him the question she had been building toward for a week. "If I decided to stay and run this ranch," she said, "what would you want in return for your labor debt and your continued work here?" He looked at the sky for a long moment. The sunset was spectacular, the kind of Cimarron sky that looked painted on, all deep orange and blood-red with cloud banks piled up in the west like a country of their own. "I'd want a written partnership agreement," he said. "Equal stakes, split fairly. You bring the land and the inheritance, I bring 3 years of built equity and ongoing labor. The debt gets converted to partnership capital." "That's a reasonable arrangement," she said. He turned to look at her. "There's something else I want to say, and I'd rather say it plainly than have it come out sideways over time." "Say it then." "I've been on this land 3 years," he said. "I know what it needs and I know what I need. I work better with someone than alone, and I mean that in every sense of the word, not just the business sense. I think you know what I mean by that." The air between them was very still. Down in the pasture below the house, one of the cattle called once and went quiet. "I've been told I'm too independent for any ranch," she said. She meant it lightly, but she watched his face when she said it. He made a sound that was, unequivocally and for the first time, a laugh, a real one, brief and warm, the kind that came from genuine amusement rather than social calculation. "I know," he said. "Pemberton said something to that effect in Red Fork last month when he heard you were coming. He said that old Wade's niece was too independent for any ranch and that she'd be back in Kansas inside a week." "Did he?" she said. "He did." John looked back out at the sunset. "I told him that sounded exactly like the kind of woman I needed running this ranch." She looked at him for a long time. The last red light was on his face, and he was not looking back at her. He was looking at the horizon with the composure of a man who had said what he meant and intended to let it sit without fussing over it. "That's a bold thing to say about a woman you'd known for a month second-hand," she said. "I'd known the accounts," he said. "I'd known the questions you sent through the lawyer before you came. I'd known how you drove your wagon, how you handled the mare." He paused. "A person's character is in the things they do when no one's watching them for impression." She was quiet for a moment. "You've been watching me since before I arrived." "I've been paying attention," he said, and the distinction he drew was precise and honest in a way that she found herself respecting very much. "You said in every sense of the word," she said carefully. "I want to be clear about what that means before either of us goes further with anything." He turned to look at her then fully, with the direct honesty that she had come to expect from him over the past week. "I mean, I'd like to know you better," he said, "as a partner and as a person. What that comes to over time is what it comes to. I'm not asking you to decide anything tonight." "Good," she said, "because I won't." They sat in the near dark for another hour and talked about the ranch, the practical things, the plans and the problems and the possibilities, and neither of them mentioned the other thing again that night. But it was there in the air between them, the way cedar smoke is there in autumn air, present and particular and not unpleasant at all. Edna wrote to Curtis and Dill in Kansas the next morning, telling them she would be gone longer than originally planned. She did not tell them why. The second week deepened everything. She and John worked the ranch together with a synchrony that she would not have predicted and could not quite explain. They did not always agree, and when they disagreed, they said so with the direct, undecorated frankness of 2 people who had decided at some unspoken moment that they were not going to waste time pretending with each other. But even the disagreements had a quality of respect in them that she had rarely experienced, and in the work itself, they moved together easily, reading the same land with the same practiced eye, making decisions with the same combination of patience and precision. On a Wednesday afternoon in the second week, they were bringing the cattle in from the south pasture when a thunderstorm rolled in off the Cimarron with almost no warning. The sky went from clear to a dark, churning green in the space of 30 minutes, and the cattle began to move wrong, the way cattle move when they are going to scatter. There was no time for discussion. Edna had already seen what was happening on the south flank and had her mare cutting before John had turned to look that direction. She worked the scattering edge of the herd with a precise, controlled urgency that came from years of handling animals in emergency conditions. And John read what she was doing immediately and went to the opposite flank. And they held the herd together with the coordination of people who had been doing this for years rather than days. The rain hit hard and horizontal, and the lightning cracked close enough that the air smelled of hot copper, and neither of them stopped moving until every animal was through the gate, and the gate was closed. Then they sat on their horses in the driving rain and looked at each other. "That was well done," he said. He was soaked to the bone, his hat battered flat by the downpour, and his expression was the fullest she had seen it, animated and alive with the specific aliveness that comes from doing something hard and doing it right. "That was good cattle work," she said, and she was smiling. She became aware of the smile after the fact, the way you become aware of a sound that has been in a room for a while before you actually hear it. He smiled back at her, and it transformed his face, not into something different, but into something more fully itself, warmer and younger, and she thought that a man who smiled like that was a man who kept something back as a general rule and let it out only when it was real. "Come on," he said. "Let's get out of this rain." They ran the horses to the barn and got the animals settled, and then stood in the dry barn doorway watching the rain sheet across the yard, while the lightning walked across the plains to the south. They were both soaked and neither of them particularly cared, and they stood shoulder to shoulder close, physically close in a way they had not been before, and watched the storm. "I'm going to sell the Kansas farm," she said. He turned to look at her. "I've been working through it," she said. "The farm up there is good land, but it's tenanted land, in the sense that it was my father's land and I've been holding it as a kind of placeholder. This is different." She looked at the rain, at the red clay turning dark and running in the yard, at the pasture beyond the barn catching the storm like a living thing. "This is a place that has something to build from." "Edna," he said, and the way he said her name was different from before, quieter, more deliberate. "Don't say anything yet," she said. "I'm still thinking." "I know you are," he said. "I wasn't going to say anything. I was just saying your name because I wanted to." She looked at him. He looked back, steady and warm, rain dripping from the brim of his pushed-back hat, and she thought that she had met a great many people in her 28 years, and she had never once met a man who understood the difference between filling silence and respecting it. She took his hand. She did it the way she did most things, directly, without ceremony, just reached over and took his large, work-roughened hand in hers, and he turned his palm and held her hand back, and they stood in the barn doorway watching the storm move north until the rain lightened to a drizzle, and the sky turned the soft gray of an old wool coat. In the third week, Edna rode into Red Fork with John to deal with several pieces of practical business, paying the feed merchant in Enid by mail, filing papers with the county land office, visiting the small lawyer's office above the general store, where a taciturn man named Aldridge handled property matters. The town of Red Fork in the spring of 1882 was the kind of town that the Cimarron territory was made of: a main street of frame buildings in various stages of permanence, a hotel that doubled as a boarding house, a saloon that was the social center of the community, a general store, a church that was also used for school twice a week, and a population of perhaps 300 people in the town itself, with another 200 scattered across the surrounding ranches and homesteads. The town looked at Edna Thatcher with the concentrated interest of a community that did not receive much new material to examine. She was aware of the looking and did not adjust her behavior for it in either direction. She did not become more careful or more ostentatious. She simply went about her business. She paid the feed debt. She sat with Aldridge and went through the paperwork of the estate. She was signing her name to a land transfer document when Aldridge, a small, dry man who had the manner of someone who had seen every variety of human transaction, looked at her over his reading glasses and said, "You know, most people expected you to sell and go back to Kansas." "Most people are often wrong," she said pleasantly, and signed her name. She and John had dinner at the hotel, which served a reasonable beef stew in a small dining room where 4 other tables were occupied by ranch men and their families. Several of the men knew John and nodded to him, and he introduced Edna at each table with the simple directness of someone who was not trying to establish anything or qualify anything. "Edna Thatcher. She's taken over the Garrison Creek Ranch." And she met the introductions the same way. At the last table, a woman named Martha Hennessy, who ran the general store with her husband, caught Edna's eye and gave her a look of the particular quiet solidarity that women in frontier communities exchanged when the situation called for it. A look that said, without words, that Martha Hennessy had noted what Edna was doing and thought well of it. Edna gave her a small, direct nod back. Then she sat down across from John and they ate their stew and talked about whether to expand the cattle herd before winter or wait another year. "Wait," Edna said. "Consolidate the operation first. We need to fix the south fence completely and develop that second water source before we have more animals than we can support in a dry year." "That's what I think too," he said. "Then we agree," she said. "We agree more than I would have expected," he said, and there was something warm and careful in the way he said it. "Is that unusual for you?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "I've worked with a lot of people over the years," he said. "Most arrangements are one person carrying the weight of the thinking and the other person following along. This is different." He looked at her steadily. "You think the same way I think, but you come at things from a different angle, and between the two views you can see more of the problem." "That's a practical way to describe it," she said. "It's also not only the practical thing I'm describing," he said. She looked at him across the table in the small hotel dining room in Red Fork, Cimarron territory, in the spring of 1882. His expression was open in a way it hadn't been in the first days. The reserve was still there, the quietness, but the warmth behind it was no longer subterranean. It was there in his eyes when he looked at her, steady and particular and entirely directed at her. She felt something shift in herself, not dramatically, not like something breaking or opening, but the way the ground shifts in spring when the frost goes out of it, gradually, fundamentally, changing the quality of what stood on it. "I know," she said quietly. They walked back to the livery stable where their horses were housed in the clean May evening, and on the wooden sidewalk in front of the general store, where the lamplight from the window made a warm square on the ground, he stopped walking. She stopped beside him. He reached over and tucked a loose strand of her hair back from her face with one careful, deliberate hand, and she turned her face toward that touch, and he said, very quietly, "May I?" "Yes," she said. He kissed her, there on the sidewalk in the lamplight, with a quietness and care that matched everything else about him, and she kissed him back with the directness that matched everything about her, and it was not a tentative kiss. It had the quality of something that had been coming for 3 weeks with the same slow, inevitable momentum as the spring itself, working its way up through cold ground. They walked back to the livery without saying much, mounted their horses and rode the 8 miles back to the ranch under a sky full of stars, riding side by side, and the only thing that was different from the ride into town was that somewhere past the Second Creek crossing, he reached over and took her hand briefly, just for a moment, and then let go to navigate his horse through a rocky stretch, and she thought that even that small, practical release was characteristic of him in a way she understood and liked. In the weeks that followed, Edna and John worked the ranch and built the partnership with the same careful attention they gave to every task, and their personal understanding of each other deepened alongside it. The two things woven together in the daily fabric of the ranch work, so that sometimes she could not have said precisely where the professional ended and the personal began, and she thought that was probably how it ought to be. She was direct with him about everything, about the ranch, about her plans, about her opinions of his decisions when she thought they needed discussion, and he valued that directness in the way she valued his steadiness, as the particular quality that made the other person who they were. He never once suggested, implicitly or explicitly, that she should moderate her views for politeness or defer to his judgment because he was male. He treated her thinking as something to engage with, and she gave his the same respect. They argued sometimes over the fencing priorities, over whether to hire a second regular ranch hand before winter, over a horse he wanted to buy at the Red Fork sale that she thought was being sold for reasons its seller was not disclosing. They argued with heat and directness and complete absence of cruelty, and they resolved arguments the way they resolved any other problem, by looking at the evidence until they could both see what was actually true. She had been right about the horse. He acknowledged it without fuss and they moved on. He had been right about the second ranch hand. She acknowledged it the same way. Silas Pemberton came back in June, as John had predicted. This time he brought a man with him who was not quite as well dressed as Pemberton, but had the look of someone who was present to make things more formal, and Edna received them on the porch with the particular quality of polite implacability that she had been practicing since her 20s. Pemberton's new offer was $5,200, significantly more than his first, and he delivered it with the gravity of a man presenting something that could not reasonably be refused. "Mr. Pemberton," Edna said, "the answer is the same as it was before. This ranch is not for sale. Miss Thatcher, you should understand that development in this territory is going to favor larger consolidated operations. A small outfit like this, run by," he stopped himself, but not quite in time. "Run by a woman," she said helpfully without anger. "You can say it, I'm not fragile." Pemberton cleared his throat. "The challenges are considerable." "They are," she agreed. "I find them interesting. Thank you for your visit." She watched them ride out, and then she heard the screen door behind her and turned to find John leaning in the doorway with his arms crossed and his expression carrying something that was unmistakably admiring. "You enjoyed that," he said. "Marginally," she said, and this time she let herself smile all the way. He pushed off the doorframe and crossed the porch to where she was standing, and he kissed her in the full daylight with the creek sparkling in the background and the fruit trees in their summer leaf. And it was a real kiss, warm and thorough, and without any of the tentativeness of the first one, a kiss that knew where it was and who it was between. Pemberton did not come back a third time. July arrived with the heat that the Cimarron territory brought in summer dry and relentless, the grass bleaching pale in the draws, the creek dropping to a lower flow, the cattle seeking shade in the cedar breaks in the middle of the day. Edna had grown up in Kansas heat and was not surprised by it. She adapted, shifting the heavier work to early morning and evening the way the land required, and she drank water steadily and wore her hat and kept her sense of humor about the temperature, which was, she had found, the most practical approach. One afternoon in mid-July, riding the eastern fence line in the early evening cool, she and John came across a section where the wire had been cut 3 strands cleanly with a tool. John dismounted and examined the cut ends in the golden evening light. He said nothing for a moment. "Pemberton," she asked. "Could be someone working for him," he said. "Or it could be unrelated. There are some free-range cattle men in this territory who object to fenced land on principle." He stood up. "But the timing suggests Pemberton. We should report it to the county sheriff," she said. "I'll ride to Red Fork tomorrow," he said. "In the meantime, we'll need to fix this tonight before the cattle drift." He looked at her. "This is the less romantic part of ranching." "I know," she said. "Hand me the wire." They repaired the fence by the last of the evening light, working alongside each other with the tools they kept in their saddle bags for exactly this kind of emergency, and when they were done she looked at the repaired section with the satisfaction of a solid job and said, "Do you think it'll be a persistent problem?" "It might be," he said honestly. "The territory is changing." "The fencing wars that happened in Texas a couple of years back," he paused, and she nodded. She had read about them, the conflict between open-range ranchers and those who fenced, a conflict that had turned violent in some places. That kind of tension is in this country too. I think Pemberton is not above stirring it to his advantage. She considered this. "Then we need to be visible," she said. "In the community, we need people to know this ranch is operating and its owners are engaged with the territory. Not in a way that invites trouble, but in a way that makes it clear we're not going to be pushed." He looked at her with the expression she had come to know as his version of being impressed, which was characterized mainly by a certain quality of attentiveness in his eyes. "You think strategically," he said. "I think practically," she said. "Those are the same thing when you do it," he said. They rode back in the warm dusk, and somewhere between the eastern fence line and the home pasture he said quietly, "I want to ask you something." "Ask it," she said. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said. "But I want to ask it right, not like a business proposition on horseback in the July heat." She looked straight ahead at the pasture, at the house with its lamplight beginning to glow in the early evening. "Then ask it right," she said, and the steadiness in her voice was the most she could do to conceal the fact that her heart was doing something it had not done in a long time. He asked it right 2 evenings later. He made supper himself, the best meal the ranch had produced since she arrived, which was a roasted prairie chicken with dried apple and sage stuffing, and a cornbread that was genuinely excellent, and a peach preserve he had put up himself from the tree behind the house that had given its first small harvest that summer, each peach small and intensely flavored the way first fruits are. After supper, he brought 2 glasses of the modest wine that the general store in Red Fork had started stocking from a Missouri supplier, and they sat on the porch in the cooling evening, and the stars were enormous above the Cimarron grassland, and the creek murmured in the darkness below the house. He told her what she meant to him. He said it carefully and without flourish, but with a completeness that left nothing important out. That she was the most genuinely herself person he had ever known, that she met the world without apology and without armor, that working beside her had shown him what a real partnership was supposed to feel like, that he loved her with the specific, decided love of a man who had thought about it and was sure. And he asked her to marry him, holding her hand in the starlight, with the fruit trees invisible in the darkness but present, because they had both planted something here that was growing. She said yes. She said it the way she said most things, directly, without fuss, without the kind of performative hesitation that would have been false to who she was. She said yes, and she meant it in every dimension of the word, with the full certainty of someone who had been thinking carefully for months and had arrived at the one answer that fit all the evidence. He put his arms around her and held her in the warm summer night, and she leaned against him and felt, for the first time in a very long time, the particular quality of rest that comes not from stopping but from being exactly where you have decided to be. They were married in September 1882 in the Red Fork Church, on a cool morning when the first hint of autumn was in the air, and the sunflowers along the road to town were going to seed in their golden ranks. The ceremony was performed by the Reverend Alcott, who was a small, energetic man with a good sense of what people actually needed to hear. There were perhaps 30 people in attendance, the Red Fork community that they had made their own over the summer, Felipe and the other ranch hands, Martha Hennessy and her husband from the general store, the county surveyor who had become a friend of John's, and Edna's 2 hired men from Kansas, Curtis and Dill, who had made the trip down at her invitation and stood in their Sunday clothes looking both proud and slightly overwhelmed. Edna wore a dress she had made from a bolt of deep blue fabric she had found in the general store's back room, a practical style that suited the setting and her nature clean and well-made, without excess ornamentation. She had braided flowers from the ranch pasture into her hair, and John, seeing her walk toward him up the church aisle, had the particular expression of a man who was registering something too large to fit into any single reaction. He wore his best coat and had polished his boots to a degree that suggested serious effort, and he had, she saw, gotten his hair cut properly at the barber shop, and he stood at the front of the church looking at her with the clear, steady warmth that was his normal expression on its best day. The Reverend asked if they would take each other, and they both said yes with the immediate conviction of people who had done a great deal of thinking before reaching the church and had no reservations left. The reception was held in the churchyard, with food brought by the community in the frontier tradition of shared tables, pies and smoked meat and summer vegetables, and a remarkable 3-layer cake that Martha Hennessy had made and transported from the store wrapped in clean cloth and showing not a single settling crack. Someone had brought a fiddle and someone else had brought a second fiddle, and the afternoon had music in it and dancing on the dry September grass. John danced with her with the same quality he brought to everything, attentively, in tune with her rhythm, leading just enough and no more. She danced the way she rode, with a fluid economy that was pleasing to watch even to people who did not particularly like dancing. Curtis, her old hired man from Kansas, found her at one edge of the gathering when the dancing paused, and took her hand with the dignity of an older man who had known her since she was a girl. "Your father would be proud," he said, and she thanked him and meant the thanks with her whole heart. The afternoon came to its close, and the guests dispersed back to their ranches and homes, and Edna and John drove back along the creek road in the cool September evening with the last of the sunflowers, and the blue sky above the Cimarron and all of their life ahead of them. She looked at the land as they drove, the grass going gold and the cedar brakes dark green, and the creek catching the last light, and she thought, this is what it feels like when something is exactly right. Not easy. Not without difficulty or work or the kinds of problems that land and weather and the particular hostility of the world toward women doing things independently of men would bring to their lives regularly and without apology. But right, in the fundamental sense, in the sense that she was here because she had decided to be, and she was who she was, and he knew that and had chosen her for exactly that reason. She turned to look at him. He was watching the road, reins loose in his hands, and some instinct made him turn to meet her gaze. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I'm thinking," she said, "that Pemberton was right, that I'm too independent for most ranches. And I'm thinking that's entirely his problem." He laughed, the full warm laugh she had first heard in the summer, and that she had discovered was more frequent than his early reserve suggested, and he reached over and put his arm around her on the wagon seat, and she settled against his side, and they drove home in the cooling evening with the stars beginning to show in the east. The autumn of 1882 brought with it the consolidation of everything they had been building, the ranch, the partnership, the life. They hired a second ranch hand, a young man named Thomas from a farming family to the north who was honest and steady and good with horses, which was all they asked. They repaired the south fence completely and began the work on the second water source, digging out the silted spring in the eastern draw and improving it with a stone and clay lining that would serve the cattle well in dry years. The wire-cutting incident was not repeated, which John thought was partly because of the community standing they had established, and partly because Pemberton's attention had moved to a different target, a homestead to the west whose owner had fallen into debt. Edna thought about that homestead and the family on it, and felt the particular sharp frustration of knowing she could not solve every problem the territory presented. She filed it as something to watch and be ready to help with if the moment came. In November, she sat down with the ledger and the accounts and went through the year with John. The ranch had ended the year in a reasonable position despite the costs of the improvements and the wedding expenses and the new hire. The cattle were healthy. The debt to John had been formally converted to partnership capital as they had agreed, and the projections for the following year, if the weather cooperated, were genuinely good. "We're in the black," she said, closing the ledger. "We're in the black," he agreed. She set the ledger aside and looked at him across the table. "I want to tell you something," she said. He waited, in the way that he always waited, completely, without filling the space. "I'm going to have a baby," she said. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 4 seconds, and in those 4 seconds his face moved through something that was, she thought, one of the most honest things she had ever seen happen on a person's face: pure, unguarded surprise, and then a flooding warmth, and something that might have been the closest thing to wonder she had ever seen from him. He came around the table and took her face in his hands and looked at her with that full, warm, unguarded expression, and he said, very quietly, "Edna." "John," she said back. He kissed her, and then he held her, and outside the windows of the ranch house, the first snow of the winter was coming down in soft, steady flakes, covering the red clay and the dry grass and the bare branches of the fruit trees in white. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was cold but not brutal, the kind of winter the Cimarron territory produced in its more moderate moods. Edna continued to work the ranch through the cold months, adapting to the rhythms of winter cattle management with the same practical energy she brought to everything, though she also allowed herself, for the first time in her life, to accept help without the slight internal resistance that had always accompanied such acceptance before. She allowed it because the help was offered without any suggestion that she needed it, or was incapable without it, or should step back from the work that defined her. John managed the heaviest physical labor in the worst weather without comment, and without turning it into a statement about her condition. Thomas and Felipe moved naturally to cover what needed covering, and when she was fully capable, which was most of the time, she was simply there doing the work, and no one remarked on that either. She read in the evenings from the books that she had brought in her traveling bag from Kansas, and supplemented with occasional acquisitions from the lending library that the Red Fork Church had established. She read about cattle breeding and range management, and the legal history of land rights in the territories, which was a subject that had become directly relevant to their lives, given the ongoing uncertainty of property law in the pre-statehood Cimarron territory. She shared what she read with John, and they discussed it, and occasionally their discussions became the basis for decisions she would have been comfortable defending in a court. In February, the homesteader to the west, his name was Anselm Prout, a man of about 50 with a wife and 3 grown children, came to the ranch in some distress. He had defaulted on a loan from a land agent connected to Pemberton's interests, and the agent had served notice that the property would be sold to recover the debt. Edna read the notice Prout brought with him carefully, and then read it again. She asked him several specific questions about the terms of the original loan and the amount of the default, and while she was asking them she was doing arithmetic in her head. "How much is the default?" she asked. $230, Prout said. She looked at John. He looked at her with an expression that was not quite a question. He was waiting for her to say what she was thinking, which he had learned was almost always worth waiting for. "We could lend him the money," she said. "We'd be short on our spring operating budget, and we'd need to delay the second corral expansion, but we could do it, properly documented, at a fair interest rate." "That's a risk," John said honestly. He was not saying no, he was making sure she had the full picture. "It is," she agreed. "But the alternative is that Pemberton absorbs that land and has a continuous property from the West Road all the way to our eastern fence line." She paused. "That's also a risk." John turned this over for a moment. Then he nodded. They lent Anselm Prout $250, the extra $20 to give him some working room, at a fair interest rate documented in a written agreement that Aldridge and Red Fork drew up and all 3 signed. Prout shook their hands with the deep, steady feeling of a man who had not expected this particular outcome. Pemberton's agent came back to the Prout homestead 2 weeks later and found the debt paid. The look on his face was reported to Edna by Martha Hennessy at the general store, and Edna noted it with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had played a long game correctly. The baby came in June 1883, on a warm morning when the creek was running full and the peach tree behind the house was carrying its second crop, this year more numerous than the first, the small bright fruits just beginning to turn. It was a boy. He arrived with the characteristic determination of someone who intended to be present in the world, and his eyes, when they opened, were the deep hazel of his father's. They named him Wade, for Edna's uncle who had inadvertently brought them both to this place. John held his son in the ranch house kitchen in the June light with the careful, somewhat stunned quality of a man who is discovering something entirely new about what he is capable of feeling, and Edna watched from the bed where she was recovering with the firm, satisfied exhaustion of someone who has done something very hard and done it completely. "He looks like you," she said. "He has your nose," John said, studying the baby with the attention he usually reserved for land surveys. "He has your stubbornness," she said. "I could tell during the last 2 hours." John looked up at her with a smile that was full and unguarded, and she thought, as she had thought at various moments over the past year, that she was very glad she had not sold this ranch and gone back to Kansas. Thomas came to the door of the ranch house that afternoon to ask quietly if mother and child were well, and John told him yes, and Thomas went back to the barn with the satisfied air of someone who feels himself to be, in some peripheral way, part of something good. Little Wade Garrison grew that summer in the ranch house and on the covered porch, and in the yard where the fruit trees were now established enough to give real shade, and the ranch grew around him. The herd expanding by carefully planned additions, the water sources developed, the fences sound, the accounts showing year on year the results of 2 people who thought well and worked hard and managed their land with genuine attention. Anselm Prout paid back his loan in installments faithfully over 18 months, and on the day he paid the last of it he arrived at the ranch with his wife, a small quiet woman named Ruth, who brought a jar of apple butter and shook Edna's hand with the particular wordless depth of feeling that sometimes passes between frontier women who understand what the land can do to a family and what it feels like to be pulled back from the edge of losing it. In the fall of 1883, the Red Fork School Board, which met in the church and included Martha Hennessy, the Reverend Alcott, and 3 ranch owners, asked Edna to join them. She did so, and within 6 months she had helped establish a proper library fund for the school and brokered an arrangement with the county for a second teacher to be assigned when the student population, which was growing as more families settled the territory, reached 30. John watched her move through the community with the same attention he had always paid her, and on an evening in the late fall when Wade was sitting on the kitchen floor investigating a collection of smooth creek stones she had given him, and the supper dishes were done and the accounts balanced, he said, "You know what I think?" "Tell me," she said. "I think Pemberton did us a favor," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "If he hadn't been out there trying to buy the ranch, we might not have had a reason to become as visible in this community as quickly," he said, "and you might not have had as clear an argument for staying." She considered this. "That's very charitable," she said. "It's true," he said. "It's also true that he was a small-minded man trying to take advantage of a woman he assumed would be easy to pressure," she said. "Also true," he said. "Both can be true," she said, and he smiled at her. Wade picked up a creek stone and offered it to his father with the imperious generosity of a 10-month-old child, and John accepted it with appropriate solemnity, and Edna watched the 2 of them and felt the full, complex warmth of a life that had been built piece by piece from a single telegram and a 4-day drive, and the particular stubbornness she had been told was too much for any ranch to hold. The winter of 1883 to 1884 brought news from the wider territory that occupied their discussions on many evenings. The question of statehood for the Oklahoma territories, the ongoing pressure of the cattle drives from Texas along the Kishom Trail, the changes in federal land law that were reshaping the range rights that ranchers in the Cimarron had operated under for a decade. These were not abstract concerns. They affected the daily reality of the ranch in specific ways that Edna tracked carefully, maintaining correspondence with a lawyer in Kansas City she had contacted through Aldridge's network, staying informed in a way that many of their neighboring ranchers did not. She thought often about the larger injustices of the period that operated alongside the everyday challenges of frontier life. The ongoing displacement of the native peoples of the territory, the Cheyenne and Arapaho who had been pushed off lands that had been theirs long before any of these ranches existed. She talked about this with John, who had a thoughtful and honest perspective on it. He had grown up in Texas and had seen the edges of those conflicts as a young man, and he carried a genuine awareness of the cost of the expansion that had made ranching in the territory possible. "There's nothing clean about the history of this land," he said one evening. "No," she said, "there isn't. But we can treat the people we deal with honestly and fairly, and we can teach Wade to think about it with more than his own interests in mind." "We can," he said. It was not a full solution, she knew that. It was the limited, honest thing that she could say was true. In the spring of 1884, Edna found out she was expecting again. This time she told John in the evening light on the porch. They still sat there regularly, in the two wooden chairs, watching the sunset, and his reaction was the same flooding warmth as the first time, undiminished, as if the capacity for that particular feeling had not been exhausted by its first expression, but had been deepened by it. "How are you feeling?" he asked, which was the first thing he asked. "Exactly as I felt last time," she said, "which was fine and will be fine again." "I know it will," he said. "I have strong evidence," she laughed. He put his arm around her and pulled her close on the porch, and Wade, who had recently begun walking and now navigated the porch with the focused determination of a small explorer, walked over to them and put his hands on his mother's knee and looked up at them both with the inscrutable assessment of a 1-year-old who knows something is happening. "You're going to be a brother," Edna told him. He responded by sitting down hard on the porch boards and beginning to examine a knot in the wood, which she thought was about the appropriate level of engagement for his age. The second child came in November 1884, on a cold, clear night when the stars over the Cimarron were extraordinary. She was a girl, small and fierce, and immediately opinionated about everything within her field of perception. They named her Nell, for John's mother who had taught school. And so the ranch grew, and the family grew, and the life that had begun with a telegram and a dead uncle's debt grew into something that had its own depth and weight and texture, something that would outlast both of them and pass to their children, and their children's children in the particular way that land does when people love it well. In the late spring of 1885, Edna rode the whole of the ranch property alone one morning. John was in Red Fork for a meeting with the county land office about a boundary dispute with a neighboring property, and she took the full circuit of the 740 acres in the warming May light, the same May light that had been on the land when she arrived 3 years ago. She rode the creek bottom where the willows were coming into leaf. She rode the south pasture where the grass was that improbable green again. She rode the eastern fence line that she and John had repaired by lamplight in a July storm. She rode up to the high cedar brake on the northwest corner of the property, which was the highest point on their land, and from there she could see the whole ranch spread below her, the house with its fruit trees, the barn and corrals, the cattle distributed in the pastures, the creek catching the morning light like a thread of silver through the grass. She could see the smoke from the kitchen chimney where Thomas, who had become as much a fixture of the ranch as the barn itself, was making coffee before the morning work began. She could see the splash of color that was the kitchen garden she had expanded last summer to include rows of sunflowers along its western edge. She could see, at the edge of the barn lot, the new second corral they had finally built the previous fall, the one they had delayed to lend Prout his $230. She sat her horse on the high ground and looked at all of it, and thought about the woman who had received a telegram in a Clearwater post office 3 years ago, and had driven south with a canvas bag and a practical intention, and no particular expectation of any of this. She thought about the thing that people had said about her, too independent for any ranch. And she thought about the man who had heard that, and said it sounded exactly like the kind of woman he needed running his. And she thought about how completely and specifically right he had turned out to be, not about her running his ranch, but about what they had made together, which was neither hers nor his, but theirs in the deepest possible sense of the word. She heard hoofbeats on the road below and recognized John's horse from 300 yards by the rhythm of the gait, the way you learn to recognize things you have paid attention to long enough. She watched him come up the road from the direction of Red Fork, and at some point he must have seen her silhouette on the high ground because he lifted his hand, and she lifted hers in return. He rode up to where she was standing on the ridge, and his horse blew and settled, and he looked out at the same view she had been looking at for the past 10 minutes, the ranch in the May morning, complete and alive and theirs. "Good meeting?" she asked. "The boundary question is settled in our favor," he said. Aldridge was thorough. "Good," she said. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the view. "What are you thinking about up here?" "The telegram," she said. He understood immediately. They were past the point of needing to specify which telegram, or what moment they were referring to, or what they meant by the shorthand of their shared history. "Good thoughts or complicated ones?" "Good ones," she said. "Straightforwardly good." He looked at her with the full, settled warmth that was his constant way now, the reserve long since dissolved into something that was still quiet but no longer withheld. "Me too," he said. They sat their horses side by side on the high point of the ranch they had built together, in the May light of the Cimarron territory, and looked at the full span of their life below them. The land, the house, the sleeping children, the cattle in the grass, the fruit trees in their white spring bloom, and there was nothing incomplete about it, nothing unresolved, nothing held back or uncertain. There was only the life itself, which was large and real and entirely their own. That evening after supper, after Wade had been put to bed and Nell had been nursed to sleep in the cradle beside the stove, they sat on the porch in the 2 wooden chairs with the big May stars overhead and the creek saying its constant, low, unhurried thing in the darkness below the house. "I want to tell you something," Edna said. He waited as he always waited, completely. "I am glad," she said, "that I drove south instead of selling at a distance." He turned to look at her. "I am glad that you were here," she said, "and that you said what you said about the kind of woman you needed." "I meant it," he said. "I know," she said. "That's what I'm glad about." He reached over and took her hand on the arm of the wooden chair, and she turned her palm and held his hand, as she had held it in the barn doorway in the rain in their second week, and the gesture was the same, simple, direct, certain. And it carried with it every month and every season and every argument and every solved problem and every kiss and every star-bright night since that first week when she had sat across a plank table from a stranger and read his accounts and begun to understand that a person's character was, as he had said, in the things they did when no one was watching them for impression. She had watched him. She knew him. He knew her. "Tell me something," she said. "What would you like to know?" She looked out at the stars, at the enormous, undiminished Cimarron sky. "Tell me what you're planning for the South pasture next year." He laughed. She laughed with him, and they sat in the warm May night and talked about the ranch, about the future of the land they had made, and the family growing inside the house behind them, and all the seasons of work and weather and small, essential happiness still ahead of them, until the night was deep, and the stars were at their highest, and the creek went on saying its unhurried, faithful thing in the dark below the house, and the life they had built together was exactly as full and real and good as the land itself, which asked nothing of them but their attention and gave back, in return, everything.